Okay, we are back with the second part of the Baroque video. This one about Johann Sebastian Bach, who was considered by many to be the greatest composer of all time, the GOAT of the classical music world. We have now moved basically to kind of the middle to the high Baroque towards the end. Bach's dates are 1685 to 1750, and it is around 1750 where we consider the beginnings of the classical period. Curiously, Bach had, he actually fathered 20 children. He was a very busy man in many respects. He also composed a tremendous amount of music. A lot of it has even been lost, but he was composing so quickly, frequently, that he didn't even copy his own music. He jotted down the original drafts, and it was copied out by somebody else, sometimes his students, sometimes his wife. But he had three sons who were actually professional composers, and one of them was composing actually in what became the new classical style. So we already see during Bach's time a changeover from the serious kind of contrapuntal music of the Baroque that's associated with Bach and the more light classical style that we will talk about pretty soon. Bach's name actually means brook in German, although Beethoven, who came after Bach, said that his name should be ocean. He was that great of a composer that every subsequent composer, through composers today, are indebted to a lot of the things that Bach did. He wrote in every genre of the day. He wrote concertos, that's works for soloists and orchestra. He wrote for orchestras. He wrote for solo players. He wrote religious music. He wrote secular music. He wrote a collection of keyboard works called the Well-Tempered Clavier. So clavier is a keyboard. It's the German word for keyboard. And well-tempered was the style of tuning that was developed during Bach's day. So we've talked about often how the idea of tuning of what we have on the piano today came about only quite slowly. And the system of tuning that Bach preferred and which ultimately became what we know today is called well-tempered. And he wrote a series of pieces for the keyboard, total of 48, and each one is in a different key. So to explore and exploit the different key possibilities available on the keyboard. Curiously, while Bach was first and foremost an organist, and he was the greatest organist of his day, he was also not known as a composer very widely. But he composed for organ, he composed for keyboard, other like harpsichords. We don't know exactly sometimes which he meant, but in some cases we believe that he may have meant actually the modern piano, which was just then coming into existence. So we can kind of see this transformation of the keyboard, physical keyboard, during Bach's own lifetime. Unlike Vivaldi, who was pretty well traveled, he became of international status. Bach, as I mentioned, was not known as a composer, which is hard to believe today, given the fact that he is considered by many, as I have said, to be the kind of the father or grandfather of the classical style, of classical music. But he was rather provincial in his life. He actually never left Germany. He was born in this town of Eisenach. And he worked in these three cities here, Curtin, Leipzig, and Weimar, but his life was relegated to a relatively small part of Germany. He was employed generally as court organists of these towns, either for a church, for a court, as is in the case of Curtin, where he composed a lot of his organ music. In Curtin, he worked for a prince there, and there he composed a lot of his instrumental music. In Weimar, where he worked in a church, and in Leipzig, where he spent the rest of his final part of his life, he was employed by the St. Thomas Church, He also taught Latin, as if composing wasn't enough, and performed, of course, and also composed for some civic functions as well. So it's very difficult to think about Bach and not being international fame during his lifetime, given his reputation today. But as I said, it was pretty limited in understanding of his abilities. And he composed tremendous amounts of music in relatively short periods of time for most of the cases. And he had day jobs. He was not of celebrity status at all. And many of his works actually were not even published during his lifetime. They were published posthumously. In some cases, one of his sons saw to it. But subsequent composers then began to recognize the greatness of the music that he left behind, and he eventually established a reputation that eclipsed pretty much everybody else. During his lifetime, a composer by the name of George Frederick Handel was actually far more better known, and we'll talk about Handel pretty soon. So Bach kept pretty much close to home with his family, growing family, and composing tremendous amounts of music. So I mentioned that he composed pretty much in every genre, depending on also where he was employed and what he was needed for. He, despite his abilities, had to take orders from his employers, and they told him that they needed this or that on a given day, and Bach set to work and got it done. Generally, he composed or for God, for in his own mind, that he was indebted to God. And for me, it's a little bit like looking at football players or baseball players after they score. And sometimes they cross themselves, or they look up and kind of give their thanks to some higher power. And definitely, regardless of what Bach was composing, it was always for God. But he composed works for solo players, he composed works for orchestra, he composed works for various combinations, and he composed a lot of religious music, which we will talk about. But as an organist, as a keyboard player, Bach's remembered largely for his contrapuntal writing. So counterpoint, which I have written here, is the idea of setting independent lines against one another. So if we think back to the Renaissance, for example, where we had individual lines kind of moving, none of them were more dominant than the other. That's an idea of counterpoint, or polyphony, which is the other word we've talked about with respect to that. Looks like I've got a little word here. And counterpoint, or polyphony, is an area that Bach dominated. He was so brilliant that he could sit down and he could write or improvise contrapuntal music like this just off the top of his head. Somebody would give him an idea, he would sit down at the keyboard, and he could start improvising. He's remembered as one of the great improvisers of all time, and it's hard to imagine that he didn't receive some kind of divine inspiration for his ability. But as I mentioned, he wrote in all the principal genres or types of his day: sonatas, suites, which were collections of dance movements for various instruments; symphonias, which were the predecessor of the symphony, which we'll talk about in the classical period. He wrote trio sonatas, which is that small ensemble group that we talked about, for example, with Corelli. In that case, was 2 violins and a continuo player. Bach wrote sometimes for 2 flutes, and whatever the instruments were. Concertos, he wrote a series of works for solo violin, just a single violin, a series of 6 works for just a single cello. Both of those are considered to be kind of the high points of solo writing for those instruments. So as I say, whatever he wrote, it was at the highest possible quality. A lot of his music is lost, but tremendous amounts of it still exist today. And when he wrote contrapuntally, that is polyphonic music for the keyboard, um, his music that he left behind, like many organ works, again, kind of set the standard for contrapuntal music. So we want to talk about the idea of a fugue, and the fugue is not a form like binary form, for example, we've talked about, or a ritornello form where you have an idea that keeps recurring. Although in a fugue, the idea does recur. But what we have in a fugue is a presentation of some kind of a subject, some theme, and it's presented in the home key, and then it is answered in the same voice or in a different voice. And when I'm speaking voices here, I'm talking about instrumental voices, typically a keyboard, or specifically in this case, an organ. So it's answered in another register on the instrument. So maybe it starts in the right hand, and then it's answered in the left hand. And the answer, and the subject answer alternation moves to a different key. So we have a subject presented in the tonic home key, and we have an answer that's presented then at the dominant, that is at the level that creates some tension, the fifth note of the scale, in other words, and that's demanding then a resolution to that. And once Bach presents a series of these subjects and answers, then he goes into what's called an episode, which is a free section based loosely on that material. And then he'll come back and present the fugue again, usually very closely allied to the original idea. It's always going to be recognizable. And I've given a diagram of kind of how the fugue, or how a fugue is laid out. Now, you have to understand that every fugue is different, and by no means does a composer, especially Bach, have to stick to this idea. But you can see here, in this case, in this map, the fugue is presented by the soprano voice, and then it's answered in the tenor voice, the third highest voice, okay, at the dominant, the fifth degree of the scale. And then the subject occurs, in this case, in the alto voice, okay? And then it's answered in the bass voice. And once it's gone through kind of this series, then he launches into an episode. And then the episode will kind of play out, and then he'll go through, again, a series of fugue entrances. Not necessarily all four voices, and it could be just one or two voices until he launches into another episode. So it's a constantly kind of shifting kaleidoscope of ideas. When it's fugal, it's very, it's contrapuntal, it's intellectual, it's very thought out and meticulous. And when it goes into an episode, it sounds more improvisatory, kind of loose, free, based on relative ideas from the fugue, but not in polyphony, not contrapuntal. And then it'll go back to the fugue again, and things become serious. And it's this kind of a back and forth play between these two ideas, contrapuntal and free, contrapuntal and free. There were a number of different kinds of ways Bach composed fugues. Most of them were pretty amazing, and kind of tricks. So he could compose, for instance, ideas that were in mirror inversion. So he would present an idea one direction, and then it was composed in such a way originally so that then he could write it backwards, and it still made sense, which is really hard for us to understand how anybody could do this today. But it's called the mirror inversion. You should look for it. It's as if you saw it in a mirror and everything was exactly backwards, so that the notes went up before, go down now, and so forth. Augmentation and diminution were other ideas that he used a lot. In other words, the subject would be presented in much more expanded form. So in double that length, for example, or triple that length. And against that, he would do maybe smaller versions. Diminution, just the opposite, so it becomes compressed. Sometimes he composed in stretto, which is an idea where a fugue subject, let's say the answer comes in before the fugue subject is finished. So comes in on top of one another, and yet somehow miraculously it's all still working. Another idea that Bach infuses a lot with his fugal writing is something called the pedal point, in which case literally a note in the pedal, that is, there's a whole series of keyboard pedals, and we'll see those as well on the organ, steps on a note, or it could be in the lower left hand part of the left hand, and just holds that note, so it becomes a drone note. It becomes a static note that doesn't move, and on top of that we have a flurry of activity. So it's a bass line, if you will, that doesn't move. It just stays put on one string, on one note. We're going to listen to one of Bach's great fugues. This one's called the Little Fugue, although it's little only with respect to the other kinds of fugues he was writing. And I didn't write the whole map out here because it goes on through about 9 presentations of the subject, but just so you have an idea, and then we will listen to it. So it starts off with a fugal exposition, and the series, or the map of that, is the one that I presented to you here. So it's going to start in the soprano, it's going to be answered in the tenor, and then the alto is going to present the next version of the subject, and that's going to be answered by the bass. And once it goes through all of this, then it's going to go into the first episode. I'll come back to that in a minute. One thing I failed to show you here is what these little asterisks mean. So he presents the subject, and after that voice presents the subject, then it goes on and does presents a kind of accompanimental line. And that accompanimental line is what is then juxtaposed to the next presentation of the answer. So you can see in this case, presents the subject, then there is an additional counterpoint, and though that line against the answer is the counterpoint. It's right here. So this is important to understand, that the subject itself is not contrapuntal. It's when it is combined with another voice. That's when the counterpoint or the polyphony happens. And so this answer is a repetition of the subject at a different pitch level. So it's almost exact. It can't be completely exact because it's a very different notes of the scale, and it doesn't always work to be an exact repetition just from the adjustments that he has to make. But sorry, my son just walked in and I had to get him out of the picture for a minute. Let me get back to our screen share here. So we were talking about the idea of the subject and answer. So that when the subject continues, it's not, this voice isn't presenting the thematic material anymore. It's moved to a different voice, but the contrary line it presents against this answer, that's where the counterpoint takes place. I will also say it's very difficult, even for musicians, to keep track of what's going on in both voices. Our ear tends to pick up one idea, and that's what it latches on to, and you're going to hear pretty soon not one, not two, sometimes several voices going on simultaneously. And whereas, let's say in a piece that's composed where you have a dominant melody and a simple bass line, there we can start to kind of wrap our head around both things that are going on, and we can certainly understand the harmony as it applies to what's going on with the melody. In this case, we've got several, for example, right here, 2 important lines, both competing for supremacy, and our limitations as humans, I think, frequently don't allow us to grab hold of everything that's going on. That didn't stop Bach, and how much he could actually hear when he was either composing the music or certainly listening to it is impossible to say. But this is a process, the idea of a fugue. It was an intellectual challenge, and it was an idea that Bach kind of, to this day, is considered to be the supreme master of the fugue. And they are remarkable pieces. I think you'll understand that when we listen to some of this little fugue. So going back to the map, so he presents the exposition of the fugal ideas, and then he goes into an episode, okay, which becomes free. Then there is another exposition. In this case, the subject is presented for the 5th time. So it was presented 4 times in the exposition before we launched into the episode. Then we have the 5th version of the subject. In this case, it's stated in the tenor, and I'll draw your attention to this. And then the soprano takes it over. And at this point, we have a pedal point in the bass, and I will draw your attention to that as well. Then it goes on to the 2nd episode, the free section. Then it's back to the 6th version of presentation of the subjects, 3rd episode, and so on. It goes through 9 presentations of the subject. And the fugue is only about 4 minutes long. So he's got a lot to go in a relatively short period of time. And then it ends on a surprising major chord at the end, which is a pretty amazing moment because the whole fugue up to this point has been in a minor key. Okay, I'm going to play for you this fugue, talk over it a little bit with you, and then you can go back and listen to it on your own. And once again, I seem to be having an issue. All right, pull this up. So let me stop this for a quick second and figure out why. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Now I got something figured out that I need to understand. Okay, so we're going to listen to the Bach's Little Fugue. I'll talk through it, and then you can listen to it on your own in high def without me talking. With any clock. There we go. And actually, you'll see an organist play it here. Okay, so soprano statement of the fugue subject. Answer. You can hear it's a slightly lower version. In the meantime, the right hand is continuing with its own notes, which is the counterpoint to the fugue subject. It's a slight extension. And there is the next version of the fugue. Answer. Now we have lots of counterpoint going on with the fugue subject in the bass. And this is an episode. It's going through a free section. There's no fugue subject. Now it comes in again. Da, 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 da. You can hear those notes in there. Episode. And there's the fugue subject again in the alto. That's the counterpoint in that right hand, moving fast. And it's amazing to think that Bach probably could have improvised something like this. There's the fugue subject again, deep in the bass. Pretty amazing to think somebody can play an instrument like this with their feet as well as their hands. It's all episodic, no fugue subject in here. And there's the pedal point. Oh, sorry. That's the fugue subject again. And the soprano now. Episode. Here we're going through different keys. Fugue subject in the bass, pretty obvious. major chord at the end. Okay, so the point where I said pedal point, that was pedal point, but it was very quick. I believe I was thinking that it was going to be another spot that was held longer, but the bass line just kind of froze on that one note. So there's an idea of a fugue. It's a very short fugue in Bach's world. In this case, just over 3 minutes long, 3.5 minutes long. All of these registers on the keyboard were not used, but there are times when an organist is actually playing on 2 registers at the same time. But you get the idea of then one voice against another voice, and you can physically see it on this video. And of course, then the bass being both the bass register here and in the pedals of the foot. Okay, so that is Bach's Little Fugue. I believe that is on your listening for one of the works you need to know. And learn to spell fugue. This is from a German word, Fugue, which is that process that I explained to you in detail at this point. And I'm going to take a break on the video here, upload this one, and then talk about some more Bach's music.